Good evening to all the beautiful people tuning in. I'm here to help you sleep. Please support me by liking the video and subscribing to the channel. I'm also curious to know where you're watching from and at what time, so drop a comment below. Are you ready? Let's start with the first story.
The title of the story:
The Possession of Father Michael. Maple Hollow had always been a place of quiet serenity, where the hum of the forest met the rhythm of daily life. Nestled deep within the heart of the countryside, the small village had never been touched by the chaos of the outside world. The townsfolk took comfort in the steady presence of Father Michael, the priest who had guided their spiritual lives for over 2 decades. His faith was a beacon of hope in the town, a constant source of light during the darkest of times. But on that fateful night, after the midnight mass, in the shadow of St. Gregory's Church, something began to shift. The night had been thick with tension. The air, heavy with the scent of damp earth and incense, seemed to thrum with an unspoken heaviness as the congregation filed out of the church. It had been a particularly solemn mass, the kind that left a lingering unease in the pit of one's stomach. But no one could have anticipated what would follow. Father Michael had been different that night. His voice, once calm and comforting, had taken on an unfamiliar edge, as though something was twisting it from the inside. The words of the liturgy seemed strained, and the flickering candlelight cast long shadows across his face, highlighting an unfamiliar sharpness in his features. As the last of the parishioners shuffled out into the cold, moonlit night, they exchanged uneasy glances, unsure if they had just witnessed something beyond the ordinary. But it wasn't until the next day that the full extent of Father Michael's transformation began to unfold. At first, the changes were subtle. His warm gaze had become distant, almost hollow, as though something deep within him had been snuffed out. When he spoke, it was no longer with the same gentleness, but with an unsettling coldness that sent shivers through the hearts of those who listened. His sermons, once filled with compassion and hope, now felt like dark warnings. The words he spoke seemed to carry a venomous undertone, the scripture twisted into something unrecognizable, and the congregation began to feel as if the sanctuary, once a place of refuge, was now suffocating. The whispers started quietly at first, among the elders, who met in hushed tones after Mass. They talked of his eyes, the way they seemed to gleam with an unnatural light, devoid of warmth, a piercing coldness that no longer mirrored the kindness he had once embodied. When questioned, Father Michael would respond cryptically, muttering phrases in a language that none could understand, his eyes darting about wildly, as if watching something unseen. Soon it became impossible to ignore. Father Michael's hands would tremble as he held the chalice during communion, his fingers twitching as though caught in an invisible grip. His voice, which had once been a symbol of comfort, now quivered with an unsettling resonance. He would whisper words that felt alien, but his lips never formed the language of the faithful. At times, he would collapse into long, awkward silences, only to suddenly shout, his voice rising with a terrifying intensity, as though trying to rip his very soul from his body. The people of Maple Hollow, once unwavering in their faith, began to feel the darkness creeping in around them. Fear spread like wildfire, infecting every corner of the town. The final straw came when Father Michael collapsed in the confessional. He had been in there for hours, the door locked, the murmur of his prayers barely audible through the thick oak. The faithful who waited outside began to grow uneasy as the minutes turned into hours, until at last a young altar boy, nervous and trembling, opened the door to find the priest slumped on the floor, unconscious, his body cold to the touch. The news of his collapse spread quickly, and the town held its breath as they waited for Father Michael to awaken. But when he did, it wasn't him. His eyes, once filled with a deep, unshakable devotion, were now cold, empty, void of any sign of the man they had once known. His voice, when it came, was like the sound of something scraping against stone, gravelly, harsh, unnatural.
"It is too late," he whispered, though no one was sure what he meant. The priest's transformation was complete. Father Michael's once vibrant presence had been overtaken by something far darker. A malevolent force, lurking just beneath the surface, had taken hold of him, twisting his body and soul into something unrecognizable. He no longer resembled the man who had devoted his life to the church. Now he was a vessel for something far more sinister. And as the days passed, the town of Maple Hollow began to feel the weight of that presence pressing down on them. Father Michael's actions were no longer his own, but the product of an unholy entity. His sermons were laced with threats, his words now a twisted mockery of the Scriptures. He would shout things from the pulpit, promises of damnation and darkness that sent the parishioners fleeing from the church in terror. But it wasn't just his words that terrified them. Strange things began happening around the church, things that couldn't be explained. Candles would flicker out, the air would grow unbearably cold, and eerie whispers would echo through the empty halls at night. Some claimed to have seen shadowy figures lurking just outside the church windows, watching from the darkness. One night, as the congregation gathered for evening prayers, a cold wind swept through the church, causing the doors to slam open with a deafening crash. Father Michael stood at the altar, his back to them, his arms raised to the heavens. His voice, a strange guttural chant, filled the air. "We are all lost," he murmured, barely audible, but his voice carried the weight of truth. "The light is gone." The townspeople, paralyzed with fear, watched as Father Michael turned slowly, his eyes glowing an unnatural red. He stared at each of them with an intensity that made their skin crawl. The air grew thick, stifling, and they could taste the metallic bitterness of fear on their tongues. "It is not me you fear, but what now dwells within." The townspeople could only watch in horror as the once revered priest, now a puppet to an unseen evil, began to laugh. It was not the laugh of a man, but something darker, more ancient. It seemed to vibrate through the very walls of the church, shaking the bones of all who heard it. But just as quickly as it had come, the laughter stopped. Father Michael collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath. His once gleaming eyes faded, leaving behind only the familiar human depths they had once known. For a moment, he seemed to be himself again. He spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "I tried. I fought it. But—" And then, just as swiftly as the moment had passed, he fell silent. His body stiffened, the breath leaving his chest in a long, rattling sigh. He was gone. But the presence that had once inhabited him lingered. The town of Maple Hollow would never be the same again. The church remained standing, but it was no longer a sanctuary. The villagers, their faith shattered, would often hear whispers on the wind, an eerie reminder that some things once released cannot be contained. The question that lingered in the air, unanswered and unnerving, remained. Who or what truly took Father Michael? And why did it leave so much terror in its wake?
The title of the story: Sister Maria's Dark Awakening. The moon hung low and full over St. Benedict's Abbey, casting long shadows across the weathered stone walls of the ancient building. Sister Maria moved silently through the convent, her white habit barely rustling in the still air. The abbey had always been a place of peace and quiet, a haven for reflection and prayer. But tonight something was different. There was an unexplainable chill in the air, a shiver that crept up her spine and made her fingers tingle with unease. Her footsteps echoed off the narrow stone hallways as she walked deeper into the abbey's oldest wing. This part of the convent had been abandoned for years, its rooms long sealed, the doors boarded up. But earlier that day, Sister Maria had noticed something out of place. A small crack in one of the old wooden doors that led to an even older part of the building. Her curiosity had gotten the best of her. Maria had always been an inquisitive soul, a thirst for knowledge that surpassed her daily tasks. It was that same curiosity that had drawn her to this forbidden corridor. And it was that same curiosity that now kept her feet moving towards the door that shouldn't have been open. She reached for the brass handle, its cold surface biting into her palm, and pushed it open. A musty scent of aged wood and forgotten years hit her immediately. Inside, the room was pitch black, save for the faintest slivers of moonlight seeping through the cracks in the walls. Maria stepped inside, her heart hammering in her chest. The air felt thick, as if the room itself was holding its breath. As her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she saw it. A small table stood in the center of the room, surrounded by dusty relics, old books, strange statues, and an ornate box that seemed out of place among the forgotten debris. But it was the journal on the table that caught her attention. Its leather cover was cracked, and the pages were yellowed with age. She opened it carefully, the brittle pages almost crumbling under her touch, and as she read, the words began to blur before her eyes, each one more disturbing than the last. It spoke of rituals and sacrifices, of a dark force sealed beneath the abbey centuries ago, something evil, something ancient. Maria felt a coldness creep through her veins as she read about the entity that had once claimed the lives of countless souls.
And then she read the final entry. It awakens, and when it does, it will claim the soul of the purest among us. Suddenly, a creaking sound broke the silence behind her. Maria spun around, heart racing, but saw nothing. The room seemed to grow darker, as if the shadows themselves were closing in. She took a deep breath and closed the journal, but as she did, she noticed something that hadn't been there before. A low, humming noise vibrating through the walls. Her head snapped toward the door she had entered through, but now it was gone, replaced by a smooth stone wall. She was trapped. The humming grew louder, more urgent. A cold breeze swept through the room, making the hair on the back of her neck stand on end. Maria could feel her chest tighten, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Something wasn't right. And then, there it was, a voice, low and whispering, barely audible, but unmistakably present. It was coming from the walls themselves. Free me, sister." Maria's body went stiff as the words washed over her. A sickening sensation crawled up her spine as she realized this wasn't just a voice. This was something alive, something ancient. A sudden pain shot through her head, blinding her. She collapsed to her knees, clutching her temples, and when she opened her eyes, everything had changed. The room was no longer empty. Shadows moved like smoke across the walls, creeping closer and closer. But the worst part, the truly terrifying part, was when Maria looked into the mirror on the far wall. Her reflection was no longer hers. Instead, the face staring back at her was gaunt, hollow-eyed, with a twisted grin that seemed to stretch unnaturally wide. The reflection whispered her name, but the voice was wrong, an echo of something dark and familiar, as though it had always been there, hidden beneath the surface. Suddenly, Maria's body jerked violently, as though someone had taken control of her. Her movements were jerky and unnatural as she stood, her eyes wide but vacant, staring at nothing. She could hear her own voice, but it wasn't her speaking. It was a voice that had been locked away for centuries, a voice that had waited for this moment to reclaim its power. When the other nuns discovered what had happened, they rushed to her side, but they found themselves paralyzed by fear.
Sister Maria was no longer the meek and gentle soul they had known. Her eyes were empty, filled with darkness, and her hands moved as if guided by an unseen force. The nuns tried to pray, to invoke the holy rites, but the entity, whatever it was, seemed impervious to their pleas. As the sisters gathered in desperate prayer, they realized something horrifying. Maria's transformation was not a possession. It was an awakening. The journal's final entry had been a warning. Sister Maria was the chosen one, but the power she now held was not the result of some demonic entity. No, it was something far more terrifying. She had always had the power within her. The entity hadn't possessed her. It had simply revealed her true nature. Sister Maria was no longer just a nun. She was something far more ancient, far more powerful, and far more terrifying. She was the Abbey's true heir, the one who would bring its darkness into the world once again. And as the nuns watched in horror, Maria's lips curled into a smile that wasn't her own.
The title of the story: The Haunted Priest of St. Augustine's. Father Augustine had always been a pillar of unwavering faith in the town of St. Helena. His presence at St. Augustine's church was a comfort to the people. The candles he lit in the darkened sanctuary seemed to burn brighter because of his devotion, and the air itself seemed to shift with each prayer he whispered. He had the kind of deep faith that inspired trust. No one ever questioned his authority, his power, or his unshakable belief in the light. He had seen hundreds of souls saved, their suffering eased by his hands, but that was before the exorcism. It had started like any other, a young woman brought to the church, writhing in agony, her body contorted unnaturally, her voice distorted into a guttural growl that made the hairs on Father Augustine's neck stand on end. The girl, Evelyn, had been possessed by a malevolent force, her eyes dark and empty, the life drained from her. Father Augustine had performed exorcisms before, each more intense than the last, but none like this. There was something different about this one, something darker that seemed to hum beneath the surface of the prayers and rituals. His voice, strong and steady, recited each line from the holy book, but he could feel an inexplicable pull, a whisper that seemed to slither into his thoughts, tugging at his very soul. In his fervor to save Evelyn, to break the chains of darkness that had shackled her, Father Augustine made a desperate, irreversible mistake. In the midst of the ritual, as the demon raged against him, he had called upon a forbidden invocation, one that he had learned years before but never used. His voice grew louder, pleading with God, demanding the demon leave, but in his zeal he inadvertently opened a doorway within himself, one that allowed the malevolent spirit to slip inside, to bind itself to him. The room had grown colder, the air thick and stifling. Evelyn's body had twisted in unnatural ways, her face momentarily contorting in a grotesque grin as the priest fell to his knees. The last thing Father Augustine remembered before the room plunged into darkness was the sudden, deafening silence that followed the demon's departure. Days after the exorcism,
Something inside Father Augustine had changed. At first it was subtle, small things. His hands shook as he held the chalice during Mass. His voice faltered in prayer. But soon it was more pronounced. He began to snap at his parishioners, his temper growing shorter with each passing day. The once warm, kind eyes that had been a source of comfort to so many were now clouded with something darker, more terrifying. Father Augustine would sometimes stop in the middle of his sermons, his gaze turning distant, as though he were looking through the walls into some faraway place. And then, just as quickly, he would snap back to reality, his words faltering, as if trying to shake off something unseen. The parishioners whispered among themselves, but none dared speak out. They saw the changes, felt the unease in the air that followed him wherever he went. He was still the same man, but something inside him had begun to twist, to darken. The light that had once radiated from him seemed to flicker and wane, replaced by a creeping shadow that clung to every step. Then came the outbursts. It started with a single harsh word. A parishioner had spoken out of turn, asking him about a delay in the sermon, and before anyone could blink, Father Augustine had grabbed the man by the collar, shaking him violently. His voice, when it came, was deep and guttural, unlike the calm, reassuring tones the townspeople had known. "I do not answer to you," he had snarled, his eyes blazing with a madness that no one had seen before. The townspeople recoiled in fear, unsure of what they were witnessing. Was it simply a momentary lapse in judgment, or had something far more sinister taken root in their priest's soul? The church, too, began to change. The unholy place that had offered sanctuary to so many now felt like a prison. The air inside was thick with an oppressive energy, stifling and unnerving. At night, creaks echoed through the old wooden beams, doors groaned open on their own, and the sound of whispering voices drifted through the pews, so faint it was almost imperceptible. Those who ventured into the church at night began to feel a coldness settle over them, a weight pressing on their chest, choking their breath. Some said they heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing in the halls when no one was around. Others spoke of the church bell tolling at odd hours, a mournful sound that seemed to reverberate deep inside their bones. Those who were brave enough to enter the sanctuary after dark would claim that they felt something watching them, lurking in the shadows. But it wasn't just the church that had become a source of terror. It was Father Augustine himself. One evening, as the townspeople gathered for Mass, an eerie stillness hung over the congregation. The usual hum of voices, the rustling of clothing, the soft murmur of prayers. It was all gone. The air seemed to freeze as Father Augustine entered the sanctuary. His once pristine white robes were stained with something dark, almost black. His face was pale, his eyes sunken, and his hands trembled as he lifted the chalice. The tension in the room was palpable. No one dared move. The priest's voice, though still filled with authority, had an unnatural rasp to it.
It was as if the very air around him had been drained of its vitality, replaced with something colder, darker. As Father Augustine spoke the words of the Mass, a strange shift occurred. The lights above flickered violently, casting shadows that twisted and writhed as though alive. The wind outside howled, rattling the stained glass windows, and for a moment it felt as if the entire world had paused. And then came the whisper. It started low, barely audible, like a distant hum, but it grew louder and more insistent. The voice was not Father Augustine's. No, it was something else, something older, more powerful. It filled the church, reverberating through the walls. "You cannot save them. They are already mine," the voice hissed. The parishioners sat frozen, their hearts pounding in their chests. Father Augustine's face twisted into a dark grin, the edges of his mouth curling unnaturally. His eyes flashed with an unholy fire as he looked at the congregation. In that moment, something snapped inside him. He screamed, a sound that wasn't entirely human, as if the demon within had fully taken control. The air grew cold, a biting frost that spread like wildfire, creeping along the floors and walls. One by one, the candles in the sanctuary flickered and died, plunging the church into darkness. But then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The church returned to silence. The cold lifted. The whisper faded into nothingness. Father Augustine collapsed to his knees, his breath shallow, his body shaking violently. The room was still. For a long moment no one moved. Then, slowly, the townspeople began to inch forward, unsure of what they had witnessed. And then the truth hit them. Father Augustine was gone. In his place stood something else, something far worse. His body, now gaunt and withered, was nothing more than a vessel for the demon that had taken root inside him. But it wasn't just Father Augustine who had been consumed. The town itself, the very air they breathed, the very ground they walked on, had become a part of the demon's domain. The horror had only just begun. As the people of St. Helena tried to flee, they found that they could not escape the grip of the darkness. The demon had taken more than just Father Augustine. It had taken the soul of the town itself. And as the last person disappeared into the night, the whispers began again, louder this time, echoing through the empty streets, the empty church. "You belong to me," the voice hissed. And with that, the town of St. Helena was swallowed whole, its people lost to the shadows that now reigned supreme.
The title of the story: The Demon Inside Sister Rose. Sister Rose had always been the embodiment of tranquility and devotion in the convent. Her gentle smile, serene demeanor, and unwavering faith had earned her the admiration of the nuns who served beside her and the reverence of the townsfolk who sought solace in the abbey. The scent of candles and incense clung to the stone walls of the convent, a quiet place where time seemed to stretch infinitely. To those who came to this sacred place, Rose was a beacon of hope, a reminder of the divine in an otherwise harsh world. But one fateful evening, that beacon would flicker and fade, consumed by something far darker than anyone could have imagined. It was in the early spring when Sister Rose was invited to participate in an ancient and secretive ritual. The abbey's abbot had received a letter from an elder monk in a distant, forgotten monastery, one that had long since been abandoned. In it, the monk described a purification ceremony that had been handed down through centuries, said to cleanse even the deepest of impurities. Rose, ever faithful and eager to help, agreed without hesitation. The ceremony, they were told, would purify the soul and strengthen the spirit. It sounded like a gift, an opportunity to serve in an even more meaningful way. But little did Sister Rose know that this gift would lead her into the grasp of something far more sinister. At first, nothing seemed amiss. Rose continued her duties with the same grace and humility that she always had. She spent long hours praying in the abbey's candlelit chapel, offering herself in service to the Lord. Her voice was soft as she sang the hymns of the morning Mass, her words flowing like a river of pure devotion. She was still the same Sister Rose, devout, kind, and full of love for God. But there was something different in the air. A weight had settled over the convent, as though the light had dimmed. Rose's eyes, once full of light, now seemed clouded, their usual bright blue replaced by shadowed shadow. Rose's prayers began to falter. The words no longer felt as pure on her lips. The unharmonious rhythm of her breath during her meditations became jagged, like a sigh caught in a throat. The other nuns began to notice these subtle changes. They spoke to one another in hushed whispers as they passed Rose in the long, cold hallways. "Have you noticed?" one of them would ask. "She isn't the same." Sister Margaret, a close friend of Rose, tried to dismiss the uneasy feelings. "She's simply tired, I'm sure. She's been working too hard." But Margaret could not ignore the restless murmurs coming from the shadows, the way Rose's footsteps echoed eerily in the empty halls at night, far later than they should have. Rose began to wander the abbey in the dead of night, her bare feet making a soft, unnerving patter against the cold stone floors. The sound echoed down the long, dark corridors. Sometimes Sister Margaret would hear faint whispers, low and unintelligible, floating through the darkness. When she searched the abbey for Rose, she found her standing motionless before a wall, eyes glazed, lips moving silently. When questioned, Rose would snap out of her trance, smile briefly, and explain it away as a moment of deep prayer. But there was no peace in her heart, no solace. The cold that had settled over the convent deepened, seeping into every room, every hallway.
The nuns, once filled with faith, could no longer ignore the ominous atmosphere that clung to Rose. It was Sister Agnes who first noticed the strange markings on Rose's skin. One evening, as they sat together in the chapel, Rose rolled up her sleeve to reveal dark, intricate patterns that twisted and writhed along her forearm, as though etched by a hand not her own. They were not just tattoos, they were symbols of something much darker, something evil. "Rose," Sister Agnes whispered, her voice trembling, "what is this? What has happened to you?"
But Rose only smiled, that same vacant, unsettling smile. "I have been chosen," she murmured softly. The nuns were paralyzed by fear, unsure of how to act. They sought the help of Father Joseph, the local priest, hoping he could rid Rose of whatever demon had taken hold of her. He arrived at the abbey with a sense of calm, but even he could not ignore the oppressive air. His voice trembled as he spoke the words of an exorcism over Rose, his prayers stilted, his eyes flicking nervously toward the ever-present shadows that seemed to gather around her. But the rituals did nothing. The demon, whatever it was, clung to her. It mocked the prayers, twisted her body in grotesque contortions, and forced strange words from her lips. Her voice was no longer the sweet, gentle sound that had once comforted the sisters. Now it crackled like the rustling of dry leaves, low and guttural. Father Joseph, desperate, tried one final exorcism, late one night when the moon hung like a sickle in the sky. The abbey's chapel was dark, its stained glass windows casting colorful faint glows across the cold stone floors. The nuns gathered, holding candles, their faces pale, their hearts heavy with dread. Sister Rose stood at the altar, her body still. The shadows had lengthened, stretching across the walls like dark, clawed fingers. Father Joseph raised his crucifix and recited the final prayer, his voice shaking. For a moment, nothing happened, and then it did. The air turned impossibly cold, so cold that the nuns could see their breath hanging like mist in the dim light. Rose's body arched back violently, her head snapping backward with a sickening crack. Her eyes rolled up into her skull, and her mouth opened wide, too wide, wider than humanly possible, as she let out a horrible, bone-chilling screech. But it wasn't Rose who screamed. The voice that poured from her throat was deep, distorted, and foreign. It hissed in languages the nuns did not understand, the words twisting and writhing in the air like serpents. "You think you can banish me? You think you can save her?" the demon growled. Father Joseph stepped back, his knees trembling, but he did not stop. "In the name of God, I command you to leave." And then the twist came, the revelation no one expected. The voice from Rose's mouth laughed. It was not a demonic laugh. No, it was hers. For in that moment, Rose's eyes flickered open, and they were not clouded, they were not empty, they were clear, but filled with a cold, chilling knowledge. "I have always been here," Rose whispered, her voice now calm but full of malice. "I was chosen long ago. You just didn't see it. The nuns gasped in horror as the truth unfolded. Rose was never pure. She had never been the beacon they thought her to be. She had welcomed the darkness willingly, even before the ritual. It had all been part of her plan, her destiny. The demon, it seemed, was not just inside her. It had always been inside her. As the last of the exorcism ritual fell silent, the abbey remained forever scarred, its walls echoing the terrible truth of what had happened that night. Rose was lost, but the demon was free, and the convent would never be the same again.
The title of the story:
The hollow voice of Father Thomas. The darkness outside was thick, suffocating, and the wind howled through the cracks in the old stone walls of the rectory. Father Thomas sat by the window, staring into the black void beyond, his fingers trembling slightly as they rested on the pages of an ancient book. He had always been a man of deep faith, a man who had devoted his life to the service of God, to the care of his flock. But lately, something had been gnawing at him. It started with the dreams that felt too real, too vivid to be mere figments of his imagination. At first, they were fleeting, hazy images of dark figures with hollow eyes that followed him wherever he went. Then the dreams grew stronger, more vivid, and he began to hear things, whispers, low, guttural murmurs that seemed to echo in the corners of his mind. It was as though something was trying to reach him, trying to get his attention. The whispers would call to him by name, and when he woke, the darkness would feel just a little too close, as though it had creeped into the very room with him. One evening, while walking through the cathedral after a late mass, Father Thomas noticed something strange. The air around him grew heavy, thick with an unseen presence. The silence was deafening, save for the occasional creak of the ancient wood beneath his feet. But it wasn't just the silence that unsettled him. It was the feeling that something was watching him, something malevolent and ancient. Suddenly, he heard it. The unmistakable sound of a door creaking open, slowly, unnaturally. It was the sacristy door, which he knew was locked. He approached it cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. As he reached for the handle, a cold gust of wind blew through the room, extinguishing the candles. In the pitch darkness, he heard it. The whisper. "Father, help me." The voice was faint, barely a breath, but it chilled him to the bone. He turned, his eyes straining to see in the inky blackness, but there was nothing there. Nothing except for the oppressive silence that clung to the cathedral like a shroud. Father Thomas stumbled backward, his breath coming in ragged gasps. What was happening to him? He couldn't explain it, but he knew deep down that this was not a mere figment of his imagination. There was something here, something ancient, something that had been waiting for him. In the days that followed, the strange occurrences only grew worse. Doors that had been securely locked would creak open in the dead of night. The sound of footsteps would echo through the hallways when no one was there. And always there were the whispers. At night, Father Thomas began to hear them even in his sleep. He would wake, drenched in sweat, his heart racing, as the whispers would continue to haunt him, even in the silence of his own room. The voices seemed to come from every corner, from every shadow, from the very walls themselves.
One evening, driven by a mixture of fear and curiosity, Father Thomas ventured into the crypt beneath the cathedral. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. The flickering candlelight cast long, distorted shadows on the walls, making it seem as though the very stones were alive. In the center of the crypt, beneath a heavy stone slab, was an ancient relic, a small, intricately carved box covered in dust and cobwebs. Something about it called to him. He couldn't explain why, but he knew he had to open it. His hands shook as he lifted the lid, and when he did, a rush of cold air poured out from within. Inside the box was a dark, twisted figure, no larger than a human hand, its features obscured by age and decay. As soon as Father Thomas touched it, a sudden jolt of electricity coursed through his body, and the world around him went black. When he awoke, the crypt was empty, but he was not the same. His heart raced, his skin cold and clammy, and his mind was filled with a single, all-consuming thought: get out. Over the next few days, Father Thomas began to change. His once gentle demeanor became cold, distant, and frightening. His eyes were hollow, his voice low and unnervingly calm. The whispers no longer came from the shadows, they came from him. His congregation began to notice, at first with concern, then with growing fear. One evening, as Father Thomas stood before his congregation, delivering a sermon, the atmosphere in the church shifted. The air grew thick, the candles flickered violently, and the very walls seemed to groan under the weight of something terrible. Father Thomas's voice was not his own. It was guttural, filled with malice, and the people in the pews trembled in terror. "I have come," he intoned, "to claim what is mine." The doors of the cathedral slammed shut, trapping the congregation inside. The air grew colder still, and the whispers grew louder, now seeming to come from every direction. One by one, the townsfolk began to realize the terrifying truth. Father Thomas had become the vessel for something far darker than they could ever imagine. Desperate, a small group of parishioners decided to confront him. Armed with holy water and prayers, they approached the possessed priest, but when they spoke his name, Father Thomas smiled, a smile that was not his own, and then, with a voice that was no longer his, he whispered, "You should never have come." Suddenly, the ground beneath them shook, and the lights flickered out. The last thing they heard was the sound of a door creaking open in the distance. Father Thomas was gone, and in his place there was only darkness. The following day, The church was silent. The townsfolk gathered in prayer, but there was no sign of the priest. Yet, deep within the crypt, the box lay open, and the whispers, they never stopped.
The title of the story: The Demon Possession of Sister Annabel. The chapel bell tolled as the pale light of the moon filtered through the stained glass windows, casting long shadows across the dimly lit halls of the convent. Sister Annabel moved silently through the cloister, her footsteps echoing in the stillness of the stone floors. She was young, but there was a certain weight to her demeanor, an intensity that set her apart from the other nuns. She had always felt a subtle pull towards something unknown, something beyond the prayers and hymns of the convent. It was during one of these late-night walks, driven by an unexplainable compulsion, that she discovered the forbidden book. The library was a place few ventured. The rows of ancient tomes were forgotten, gathering dust like relics from another age. But on this particular evening, as Sister Annabel walked past the shelves, a book lying on the floor caught her eye. It was small, bound in dark, weathered leather, and sealed with a strange symbol that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Despite the instinctive warning that flashed in her mind, she reached for it. As her fingers brushed against the cover, a chill ran through her body, and a low hum filled the air. With trembling hands, she opened the first page. The words were in a language she did not recognize, but their meaning seeped into her consciousness as if the book itself was speaking directly to her soul. The room grew colder, the shadows stretching unnaturally long. She felt a presence, something watching her. But instead of fear, she felt an insatiable thirst for more. She continued reading. The next day, Annabel could not shake the sense that something had changed. The sky was overcast, and the usually serene convent felt stifling, as though the very air was thick with unseen pressure. She moved through the halls, her steps measured, but the world around her felt wrong. When she spoke to the other nuns, her voice was different, distant, colder. It was as if something inside her had awakened, something foreign and predatory. Days passed, and Annabel's behavior became increasingly erratic. She would stare at the walls for hours, her eyes wide, unblinking. During prayers, she would mutter strange phrases in a language none of the nuns recognized. Her hands would shake violently, and at times she would lash out at the other nuns, her strength unnaturally powerful for someone of her size. The other sisters whispered in fear. "Something is wrong with Sister Annabel," they would say in hushed tones. "She is not the same." One night, as Annabel lay in her cell, her body contorted in ways that defied human movement, the convent's eldest nun, Sister Marguerite, decided they could wait no longer. She approached the abbey's door, her heart heavy with the weight of their final hope. She had sent for Father Bertrand, a priest known for his expertise in exorcisms. He was their only hope, though the nuns were aware that calling upon such dark rituals could have dire consequences. Father Bertrand arrived late in the evening, his face solemn and drawn. He entered the chapel, where Annabel had been restrained to a wooden chair, her head tilted back at an impossible angle. Her eyes glowed with a pale, unnatural light, and her lips twisted into a grotesque smile. When she spoke, it was not her voice. They were the voices of many, echoing through the room in unholy harmony. "I have waited for so long, priest. You are too late," the voice hissed. Father Bertrand stepped forward, holding a crucifix, his hands trembling slightly. He began chanting, invoking the name of God, but with each word he uttered, the air grew heavier. The walls of the convent seemed to groan, the floorboards creaking under an invisible weight. Sister Annabel's body began to jerk and twist as though something inside her was struggling to break free. The nuns gathered in the back of the chapel, held their breath as the battle between light and darkness raged. Father Bertrand's voice grew louder, more forceful, but Annabel's laughter filled the room, deep, menacing, and cold. Then, just as it seemed the exorcism would fail, a sudden and unnatural silence fell. The room froze. For a moment, it felt as though time itself had stopped. Annabel's body slumped forward, her eyes no longer glowing, and for the briefest of moments, she appeared normal. She blinked slowly, then gazed at Father Bertrand with a mixture of confusion and fear. The voices were gone. But before the priest could speak, Annabel let out a single, haunting laugh, soft but filled with chilling malice. "Do you think it's over?" she whispered, her voice now eerily calm. "You've only delayed the inevitable. I was never the one you needed to save." Father Bertrand recoiled as the walls of the convent trembled. The room seemed to shift, as though very building had turned against them. In that moment, it became clear. The demon had never truly been inside Annabel. It had always been the convent itself, waiting for someone to awaken it. With one final deafening scream, the walls of the chapel collapsed. The convent, once a sanctuary, was now the tomb of all who had dared to enter. The demon was free.